This is Hawaii, the only US state in the tropics and one of the most beautiful places on Earth. A place where everyone would want to live and that's lucky enough to attract millions of tourists, spending a lot of money for a holiday of their dreams. Or at least, that's how it seems. Which is why it might be a little surprising that the people who get to live in this paradise are not as happy as one would expect, since more people have been leaving the island than coming in for 7 years in a row. Because while Hawaii might seem like a paradise to tourists, it's definitely not one for the locals. And ironically, tourism has a lot to do with that, as it's making life in Hawaii a lot worse and driving a lot of people out, while at the same time, the state and the people there can't survive without it. So why are Hawaiians rejecting tourism? Why is life on the island becoming increasingly difficult? And why is tourism both keeping the island alive and slowly killing it at the same time? This is the dark side of Hawaii. So let's start by looking at what tourism actually means for Hawaii, because talking about how bad it is doesn't really make sense without first explaining how important it is at the same time. In 2019, before the pandemic, over 10 million people visited Hawaii in just 1 year, a figure which, by the way, has been going up every year for decades. The tourists spend around $18 billion every year. The tourism industry makes up roughly a quarter of Hawaii's economy and over a third of all the jobs in the state. And the industry employs more than 200,000 people, with even more jobs that are indirectly connected to tourism as well. When the COVID pandemic shut down tourism in Hawaii for just a few months, the unemployment skyrocketed from 2.7 to 37% in just a few months, as more than a third of workers on the island lost their jobs, and a number of businesses were forced to shut down, in a little presentation of what Hawaii might look like without it. In other words, tourists and the money they bring is literally a lifeline, without which the state couldn't really survive. And so that means that's good, right? Well, yes, but actually no. Now, there are a number of reasons why people might feel that tourism is no longer a benefit. From nature that's suffering from way too many people, to some tourists who just act like assholes. But more importantly, there's the economic impact, because too much tourism is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, yes, tourism brings money and creates jobs, but it also hugely inflates the cost of living. Hawaii would already be quite expensive anyway, since it's an island quite far away from everything that doesn't produce much, and everything has to be shipped there, which increases the costs. But tourism makes it a lot worse, mostly because it massively inflates the housing prices. Hawaii is actually quite small. Even though the state is made up of over 100 different islands, the available land is naturally quite limited. And because of the extremely strict regulations of what can be built where, only 4% of land in the state is actually zoned for residential housing, and only 0.3% is zoned for larger multifamily homes, meaning that already from the beginning, available land is incredibly rare. But the demand is not just from the locals who want a place to live, but also from investors who want to buy land to build accommodation for the constantly increasing numbers of tourists, and they're willing to pay a lot of money for it, a lot more than locals could ever afford. As a result, Hawaii has one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States, on top of already having the highest cost of living out of all the 50 states. The median price of a house in Hawaii is over $800,000, and the average price of a house in Oahu, the third largest island, increased by more than $300,000 in just 3 years, between 2019 and 2022. That is impacting everything from the number of people living in poverty to high rates of homelessness. But the thing is that while locals are paying the costs of increasing tourism industry, they don't actually get to benefit from it that much. First, most of the profits from the hotels and vacation rentals driving housing prices up are not actually staying in Hawaii. Many of the hotels are naturally owned and run by large multinational corporations, and although they do pay some state taxes in Hawaii, most of the profits end up leaving the state. And many of the vacation rentals are owned by non-Hawaiian residents as well as investment properties, which is incentivized by the fact that Hawaii has the lowest property tax in the United States. And although the tourism industry does create a lot of jobs, that is barely a benefit, since those jobs are not actually the kind of jobs that you want, because they tend to be among the lowest paid on average. The average wage in the hospitality industry is about half of the average US wage, and that's why Hawaii has one of the lowest average wages when adjusted to the high cost of living, because there's so many people who work in this sector. And even though the numbers of tourists coming to Hawaii have been going up for decades, that has not been translating into more money for the economy, as there is an ongoing trend of tourists spending less and less money per person in Hawaii. In 2018, tourists spent as much as they did in 1989, but there were 2.5 million of them more than back then. Meaning that although there are a lot of more tourists that put more strain on the infrastructure and take up more space, the benefit from their presence is much lower. So going back to the beginning and to people who want tourists to stop coming to Hawaii, are they right? Should Hawaii just ban tourism, and is it even possible? Well, what it could do is to limit the numbers of people who come every year. After all, some places that suffer from over-tourism are already doing that. But even if it decided to cut down the numbers of visitors by 1 million people per year, that would still be less than a 10% decrease from the pre-pandemic numbers. And so it probably wouldn't really change all that much. And so if Hawaii wanted to make really a big difference, it would have to introduce really strict limits. And limits like that would almost certainly hugely damage the economy. Without the tourists, housing costs might go down, but a third of the population that works in the industry would likely lose their jobs, which is not the outcome you want. The next question is whether the tourism industry that Hawaii is so dependent on can be replaced by something else. Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, probably not. The thing is that doing business in Hawaii other than tourism is actually incredibly difficult. If you want to manufacture something, for example, because Hawaii is so remote, it automatically comes with really high added costs for the supply chains. And both exporting and importing from and to Hawaii just costs a lot more. And while there has been a lot of talk about building a tech sector, at the moment it's virtually non-existent. The high electricity costs, the limits to internet speed, and the isolation from continental United States would make it quite hard to attract tech workers in order to build a tech hub similar to California, Texas, or Miami. And so, despite all the negative aspects it brings, tourism remains indispensable and irreplaceable, and most Hawaiians know that very well. In a poll from 2021, 67% of Hawaii residents said that the island is being run for tourists at the expense of local people. But even a higher number of people said that even so, it's still worth it anyway, because there is simply no alternative. Unfortunately, Hawaii is just too beautiful. It simply cannot afford to lose the tourism or even limit the industry. The only thing that it could theoretically do is try to squeeze more value out of every visitor and increase the amount of money spent per person to at least make it worthwhile. Turn Hawaii into a more exclusive and more expensive option rather than an experience for the masses, which is killing the island. But how exactly that would happen, or whether Hawaii will do that, is not clear. And so not much is likely going to change.